We at On the Way Home would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And in Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Welcome to On the Way Home, a podcast dedicated to the issues surrounding homelessness and the incredible experts making a difference in the lives of homeless people. Remember to subscribe to the podcast anywhere you're listening and share it with a friend.
Hello, once again, you are with Michael Braithwaite on The Way Home, our podcast brought to you by the good folks at Blue Door and the good folks at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. What's happening at the Canadian Alliance right now? Hey, if you have not been on social media, you might not know that there's a huge conference happening in November. It's the biggest of its kind in our sector. So the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness puts on an annual conference this year. Very cool that they're able to do it virtually and in person in Toronto. And I believe it may not, I don't know when this is going to air exactly, but you want to try and get it as early as possible so you get the early bird discount. They have hundreds of the best speakers from across the country, so check it out. And if you can't be there in person, virtually, sign up and check out all the different speakers they have. They have some great keynotes as well. And we at On the Way Home will be there as well, interviewing some of the brilliant minds from around the world that are trying their best to prevent and end homelessness. Now, each week on the podcast, we have incredible guests from all angles. It is a complex issue. We talk about health, we talk about justice, we talk about the prevention of homelessness, and we get that from experts in the field, from live experts, etc. Today, we will not disappoint. We have another amazing guest. Before we get there, let me just tell you a little bit about my organization, Blue Door. We are pumped because we work in, we have a lot of the work we do is in York Region, just above Toronto, and we have a two-tier municipality, so that means we have 9 municipalities, so 9 mayors, and then we have a regional government that is responsible for emergency housing, transitional housing, and they're doing some incredible work. They have built in about 18 months, which is an incredible time period to get this up, and they've built an 18-unit transitional housing unit, and Blue Door is very fortunate to be operating that, and by the time this podcast drops, it will be up and running. Adding 18 units to York Region is just incredible. Those are single units. They've been beautifully done. The building itself is very, very green and efficient, which is very cool too. So it's truly affordable. So we're really, really excited about that here at Blue Door. So lots of good stuff happening at Blue Door and lots of good stuff happening at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. But let's get to our guests. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the justice system and homelessness and some work that's been done around that. And with me today is Safiyah Husein, who is a Senior Policy Analyst at the Centre of Research and Policy at the John Howard Society of Ontario. And they just recently got a new CEO from the region of York, Kristen Cullen, who I know quite well. She's amazing, and I'm so happy for Kristen to see that happen. But let's talk about Sophia. She participates in the Centre's research and policy activities, supports the public education activities of the Society, and liaises with local offices and community partners on reform initiatives. Sophia has drafted reports, one which we'll talk about today, submissions of public education materials on criminal justice issues, including bail, the impact of police records on employment and correctional health care. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from York University and a JD from the University of Windsor, Faculty of Law. Very, very well qualified and educated. She completed her articles at the Office of Ontario Ombudsman and was called to the Ontario Bar in June 2018. We are so fortunate to have her doing the groundbreaking work she is doing and fortunate to have her on the podcast today. Sophia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you here. And we've kind of touched on justice and its relation to homelessness, etc., over time, but it's great to have an expert like yourself on the show and the work that the John Howard Society does in that realm. It's just it's unmatched in this sector. Before we get to some of those specific questions, we ask everyone the same question to start the show because there is not one answer for this. There's some related themes. But what does home mean to you?
I think that's a really good question. For me, home is definitely more than just sort of shelter and a roof over my head. I think when I think of home, I think of a place where I feel comfort, safety, a sense of belonging. So I think there's a couple key components in there for what home means.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, it's so funny, the one common theme that we often hear on the show is that people do not mention actual physical structure. That's not what jumps to their head. But they do talk about that safety, that belonging, that kind of stability, that affordable and safe place to call home brings you, for sure. Before we get chatting about and dive kind of further into the work that you're doing, can you tell us a little bit about the John Howard Society of Ontario for people that may not be familiar with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the John Howard Society of Ontario is a non-for-profit organization. We've been committed to the mandate of effective, just, and humane responses to crime and its causes for over 90 years. And there's 19 local offices across the province that deliver more than 80 evidence-based programs and services, looking at things like prevention, intervention, reintegration services across the province. So it's sort of the full spectrum of experiences with the criminal justice system, and even outside of that, looking at social justice issues. We have sort of youth programs that help with life skills. We help families navigate criminal justice, and there's programs that help with things like job training and housing services, as well as residential programs for individuals recently released from institutions. And our Center of Research and Policy at the provincial office, while we don't engage in any frontline service, we actually work on sort of bridging that gap between research and analysis and the frontline experience. We collaborate closely with local offices, and we have a team of analysts and researchers that conduct research on criminal and social justice issues, develop policy positions, to affect change, advance those policy positions to government and other organizations, and we have public education initiatives and evaluation of programs to guide future work. And so we're trying, our aim is to sort of translate that higher level research and policy into real action that affects clients that we serve across the province.
Very well said, and very, very important work. And I think people may not understand so much that we read right now about the housing crisis, how it's affecting our most vulnerable, how hard it is, even if you have a well-paying job, to find rental housing or housing of any sort that's safe and meets your life. But I don't think people quite understand, if you've had involvement with the justice system, how that affects you in trying to find housing. Let's talk a little bit about that. We know, as I mentioned, justice and homelessness are very much linked. And for those people who may not understand the linkage between it, maybe you could help us a little bit, shining a little bit of light on the intersections between homelessness and incarceration and the vicious cycle that it brings.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly is a vicious cycle, and one that's definitely a lot easier to enter than it is to get out of. As we know, and I'm sure you've talked about a lot in this space, there's a lot of factors that can lead to homelessness. So, personal issues, systemic factors, loss of employment, illness or mental health issues. And a person living with homelessness is then at increased risk of involvement with the criminal justice system. And so that's in a couple different ways. There's extra visibility. Somebody with living on the streets, living rough, has extra visibility when it comes to contact with the justice system, with police. There's also laws that are relatively easy to follow if you have a place to shelter, but may not be as easy to follow if you're living on the streets. So things like solicitation laws, for somebody whose only form of, some money to get food that day is panhandling, solicitation laws can be exceedingly difficult to follow. And the same with loitering, for people that are trying to find a place to sleep. They can be charged with loitering offenses and, having to be out in different places, trying to find somewhere warm, trying to find a bit of shelter under a little bit of a roof. So a lot of these laws can also get people caught up in the justice system when they are dealing with homelessness. And then once somebody is involved with the justice system, that also can result in homelessness or exacerbate those issues. So we know that people can be arrested, they can be held in correctional institutions, and sometimes if they're denied bail, they can be held in correctional institutions until their case goes through the courts and until there's a decision reached. And so sometimes people are actually, they're not even guilty of a crime, but they can experience long periods of incarceration. It can take days, weeks, or months. And during that time, sometimes people can lose their employment. Sometimes people can lose their housing. And when they get out, then they're, struggling to pick up those pieces. And another factor here is having a criminal record. So we know that having a criminal record is a huge barrier to employment. So for individuals who may not have even experienced any incarceration, but who may then, have justice involvement, get a criminal record, be convicted of a crime, they sometimes can face huge challenges and barriers trying to find meaningful employment, and even in some cases trying to find housing. And we know that, without employment, oftentimes loss of housing or homelessness results. And it's also difficult to get out of that. Trying to find a job when you don't have an address is exceedingly difficult. So as you can see, it all feeds into each other, and it is quite the vicious cycle.
Yeah, it's crazy when I think about it. And over the years, I've worked with and chatted with people who might have made a fairly simple mistake. Like you said, they have a criminal record, they have trouble finding a job, which means they then have trouble finding housing, which means they maybe reoffend because that's, what else am I going to do? I've got to get by to make a living. So it is that vicious cycle, right, that we need to break. Now, you recently released, John Howard Society of Ontario recently released a report called No Fixed Address, The Intersections of Justice, Involvement, and Homelessness. Can you talk a little bit about the correlation between no fixed address and incarceration?
Yeah, so, we've been talking about this linkage between justice involvement and homelessness for some time. This has been a big issue, and what we really kept coming up against was the need for data. Especially when we talk to decision makers and we want to change policy and things like that, you need to have the statistics and data to sort of back that up and support your identification of the issue. And so we wanted to sort of do a bigger research project looking at the issue and trying to quantify these numbers and how big this issue actually is. So this project, No Fixed Address, this is the first step in a broader research project. And this is a partnership between the John Howard Society of Ontario, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation, made possible by a grant from the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And this sort of looked at the link between justice involvement and homelessness, and we got our hands on some data around admissions to correctional institutions and instances where individuals cited that they did not have a fixed address, meaning that they didn't have stable, permanent housing when they were admitted. I can sort of go into a couple of the key findings if that would be helpful.
Yeah. If you get, I'm sure there was, the report is amazing, but if you talk to us about some of the major learnings, that would be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, this the main source of data for this report looked at the admissions to correctional institutions with no fixed address, so meaning that they didn't have a stable permanent address when they were admitted. We couldn't look at actual individuals. This looked at, accounts of admissions, so some people could be repeats within this data. But it does provide an estimate of the number of individuals experiencing homelessness who are being admitted to correctional institutions to give us a picture of the issue. Some of the key findings that came out of this research are that no fixed address admissions in the general population have been increasing over time. And we looked at data from 2007 to 2021, so sort of about a 15-year time period, and we saw that increasing over time. And the no fixed address admissions of Indigenous peoples has increased faster than non-Indigenous peoples over that same time period. And what we then wanted to look at is, okay, we're seeing an increase in the number of admissions that are coming in with no fixed address? Is that just because we're jailing more people over time? Is that, what does that look like in proportion to the number of people inside corrections? And we found that actually no fixed address admissions do make up an increasingly large proportion of all incarceration. So it is going up even within the population of people in correctional institutions. And, we saw that we did take sort of a regional lens and looked at different localities across the province, because we know across Ontario, very different locals, very different realities and challenges. And we found that most people living with homelessness at the time of incarceration are from the central region of Ontario. So that includes sort of the urban Toronto region. However, the proportion of no fixed address admissions has been growing the most outside of the central region, so proportion to their populations. And in some cases, it's more than others. So correctional institutions in the northern region have higher numbers of individuals with no fixed address relative to its population.
Do you know, so fascinating stuff, and I'm thinking, like I have guesses as to why in northern areas too, right? Also a lack, even more so, of affordable housing or no shelter spaces, that kind of thing, so it might be there. You mentioned it's declining over the last 15 years. Indigenous populations even more so, overrepresented. Any idea, and I don't know if the report would have dealt into this, but do you have theories on why it's been climbing so much?
I think, part of this project, and there is sort of a second part. So I alluded that this is part one. This is sort of looking at the data, and part two of this project is actually speaking to people with lived experience, speaking to stakeholders across the province, trying to get a sense of what this looks like, contextualizing this data. And I think that's one of the questions that we're trying to address is, why is this happening, and what can be done to address it? What can be done to support people and to address these rising numbers of people that are coming in with no fixed address? I think what you spoke about with access to services and supports and safe, affordable housing is a huge one. We know that across the board, not just with people with justice involvement, but access to safe, affordable housing is an issue. And more and more people are sort of being priced out of the housing market or facing issues with accessing affordable housing. And I think that's, one of the factors that's definitely involved here with this population as well.
Absolutely. Now, in any report that you do, I think some of it you'll say, that confirmed what we thought, but it's good to have the data. There's also some surprises. Are there any surprises you could share with us that came out of the work?
Yeah, I think one of the surprises that for the research team that came out of this was just how difficult it is to really capture and identify this issue. It's very hard to have data on homelessness, just because it's hard to count how many people are actually dealing with homelessness, and especially with this population. And so this lack of data is a huge challenge, and I think the research team found that to be a bit of a surprise, thinking about, okay, I realize that there are challenges with gathering this information, but when you really delve into it, it really is hard. And even the data that we had limitations, so I think that was one of the surprises. And the other thing is, it doesn't, this information, even when you do have data, it doesn't tell you the full picture. It doesn't tell you how many people with dealing with homelessness are leaving corrections. This looked at admissions data, and it doesn't tell you about what happens to them or what their life looks like, or these intersecting issues that they're experiencing and how that impacts their experience of homelessness. So I think that was probably one of the main surprises we came up against.
One of our first guests that we had on the predecessor to this podcast called Out of the Blue, or our first guest, actually, I should say, our first guest was Jesse Thistle. And Jesse now is an Indigenous PhD. He's embraced his past, and he's a best-selling author. But he talked about he had a broken ankle, and it was getting worse and worse. He could have lost his leg, and he said so. He actually committed a crime because he knew two things. If he went into prison, he thought, I don't know if it's true, but I'll have a chance to get clean, and I'll get proper medical care. And he did, and his foot healed. and he was able to do that, and he talks about the struggles. But I know for Jesse, even in all he's done, getting a pardon years after, right, to move on with his life and push forward was incredibly difficult. It was a process, and I mean, this is a well-connected and respected individual, and he's struggled hard. So I can imagine for folks coming out of, even a short-term incarceration, and that getting in the way, pardon, hopefully helping them moving forward. Where do they even start? Any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a major challenge for many people. Having a criminal record, it just follows them. It becomes almost like a life sentence because it creates that insurmountable barrier to accessing employment, to being able to move on from your criminal record. Even for people, like you mentioned, who have, moved forward and it might be decades or years after a conviction with no further interactions with the law. I think that a big piece of our work, another aspect of it, is looking at the impact of criminal records. And we've talked a lot about the impact criminal records have on employment and really trying to sort of break down some of those barriers. Education for employers on how to conduct rights respecting police record checks, because oftentimes people have blanket police record check policies for all jobs, and then they see any sort of positive result come back, anything on a record, and it's an automatic no. Whereas, there's an opportunity here to actually have some education around knowing what to look for, knowing that just because somebody had a record, had a conviction, it might be years ago, it might be completely unrelated to the job at hand, and that individual is often an excellent candidate and would actually be an asset to your organization or company. And so a lot of the work that we do is around breaking down some of those barriers and helping people actually be able to move on. And we know in the housing sector that's also a big issue. Sometimes we're seeing now people having to complete police record checks for housing applications and the same sort of issues resulting. So I think that's definitely one of the issues that we've identified. We're actually part of a couple coalitions trying to correct that issue and change hearts and minds across the province. There's a Fair Chances coalition that we're part of that are made up of employers that are actually standing up and saying, I create rights-based policies around police record checks and are interested in giving people a chance and trying to make it easier for people to access record suspensions so that these things, years after their convictions, with no new fresh convictions, are able to actually move on, seek employment, get that housing, and be able to move on from their criminal records. So that's definitely a major issue.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I remember back, I'm old enough to remember when all employers started doing the criminal reference piece. And it was, at first, was so black or white. You have one, no job or whatever. Mm-hmm. When you actually start asking a few questions and having a conversation, for so many people, it was either, as you said, years ago or something minor. I was 18 years old. It was silly. I had to fight at a bar, and I have a conviction now. I was desperate, and I passed a bad check, and when all these things where you're like, well, that's not going to at all have anything to do with their ability to do this job. And so to have that flexibility, right, but to be so risk adverse, and it's a bit of a human rights thing, I would think too, right? And so yeah, absolutely. And there's so many barriers already to people accessing housing, whether it be income related, whether it be a credit report, whether stack that upon it too. It's just another thing stopping people from moving forward in life.
Exactly.
So you've done the report. I know you don't want this. You say there's a part 2. This is not done for, hey, this is great, let's put it on a shelf. What are your hopes for this report? Talk a little bit about next steps to stage 2 and what your hopes are for that in this report, how it will be used and how it might move things forward.
Well, exactly. At the John Howard Society of Ontario, we don't do any research just for research's sake. We're not trying to conduct research just to sit on the shelf and get dusty somewhere. So the goal with everything that we do is to try and actually create a positive impact in Ontario and for our clients. With this project, so the next phase of the project, like I said, is actually talking to people with lived experience from different sites across Ontario to really understand the scope of this issue, what challenges they face, how their intersecting identities, impact these barriers that they have, what are their experiences, and then actually create a set of program and policy recommendations and strategies to enhance stability, housing stability for people who have justice involvement in the province. And so our hope is that we can actually see a positive impact and start to address this issue, start to see that line going down instead of up over the years, and start to introduce these programs across the province that can help people who are experiencing housing issues and justice involvement. We also are hoping to create tools for frontline service providers on how to assist people with justice involvement and who are experiencing homelessness. Oftentimes people might access services for various issues that they're experiencing in their life, but it helps to be able to identify and say, hey, this is a housing issue, and this is maybe where I can point you to get some assistance before it gets really bad, even in some cases to prevent homelessness or to help people access the right services and supports that they need as early on as possible in order to help make sure some of these issues don't get that bad. So I think through these sort of policy changes, through programs and tools to actually help individuals, we're hoping to make an impact.
Awesome. And I would say, you're going to build on the impact you've already had. So if clients, people listening, they have clients, they have people they're working with, or if someone listening wants to read this report, learn more about the great work you're doing at John Howard Society of Ontario, where should they go?
Well, we do have a website, so it's johnhoward.on.ca. And you can access our research there, our reports. You can find out about the other work that we're doing as well and get in touch with us if you'd like to be involved or learn more. We'd welcome that. We also do have social media, so we're on Twitter at JHS Ontario. We're on LinkedIn. You can find us at the John Howard Society of Ontario. So please, we are accessible in a couple different ways.
Amazing. Listen, so much admiration. I see you went to you were called to the bar in 2018. You probably could have done all sorts of different things, but you chose this sector. You're choosing something. You're making a massive difference. It is so appreciated, and I know many people that have worked for the John Howard Society, including Jonathan Robar, who linked us together. Just an incredible individual.
He's great.
Yeah, it's great. Right? You could have, and let me just ask you, how did you end up with John Howard or in this sector doing this kind of work?
Well, actually, the reason I got into it, so when I went to law school, I was really interested in criminal law and interested in criminal justice. And I did a lot of work with our community legal clinic. I went to school in Windsor, so down there. And I saw the ways in which, people, vulnerable, marginalized populations sort of get caught up in the criminal justice system. Working at a clinic, you see sort of low-income folks and these experiences of marginalization that cause people to get involved with the criminal justice system and prevent them from sort of getting out of that cycle. And so I got really interested in how to affect change on a more macro level. As a lawyer, you have that personal impact all the time. You have that one-on-one impact with a client. But I just sort of identified that there's a lot of bigger, higher level issues that we need to address within our criminal social justice systems. And the John Howard Society of Ontario was an opportunity to sort of look at some of those issues and explore those criminal justice issues from a higher level, affecting sort of change at a bigger level with policy. So I'm very fortunate to be in this role, and it's been a great couple of years with the organization.
Very cool. I'm so glad you chose to go that route. And it's funny, like some of the experts that have had years and years and years in this sector, they're saying homelessness is a result of bad policy. So policy absolutely matters no matter what sector you're in. You're doing work to affect change, positive change with policy, which will make big change happen. thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for all the work you do. And I encourage everyone to go check out this work. And when you move on to the second stage and you're talking with lived experts, please come back. We'd love to hear more about it.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the work that you do and this podcast. And I really have enjoyed being here. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, it's interesting. We talk to a lot of different people on this podcast, but for me, sometimes unfortunately, we don't have as many young people in the sector coming on making a difference. So it's so cool to see Sophia, the work that she is doing and the work that the John Howard Society of Ontario is doing. We see it all the time at Blue Door, unfortunately, right? Due to different situations in people's lives, they've come in contact with the criminal justice system, and then it's just a slippery slope, right? That's where chronic homelessness comes in. Sophia mentioned it. Like, we have to look at preventative ways, right? First of all, so people aren't ever, that isn't their only choice. But if it does happen, how do we, is anything with homelessness, how do we make that a short period? And how do we circumvent that from a lifetime of being on the streets? We all at some time or another have made different mistakes. And if someone's mistake has resulted in them being involved in the criminal justice, that should not be a life sentence by any means. So incredible work. And for people to understand, too, I think a large part of changing that is creating that awareness. This report will do that. Check it out. Go to their website. Check out the work they're doing. Share this podcast. In general, if we're going to prevent it in homelessness, we create more awareness, and that's what we're trying to do with this podcast, create more awareness so people really understand what homelessness is, what it isn't, and how you can be part of the solution. Well, another great guest. We will see you next time on The Way Home.